Margaret Kessler carried the box down the gravel path with both arms, the way you carry something you don't want to drop and don't want to hold either. Cardboard, the flaps folded shut, a strip of packing tape already peeling at one corner. It was meant for Warren's things. Whatever the kennel still had that belonged to him. Nobody had offered to come with her. She hadn't asked. 3 years of doing things alone had worn a groove into her, the same way her thumb had worn a groove into the edge of her wedding ring, turning it without thinking. The reception building sat low and gray at the end of the row, cinder block painted the color of wet sand. Inside, a fan turned slowly on a metal desk, pushing warm air instead of cooling anything. A young man in fatigues looked up from a clipboard, not the officer she'd spoken to on the phone. Someone lower, someone who filed things. "Ma'am, you're here for the Kessler pickup?" "Yes." He turned the clipboard toward her. "I need the training identifier on file to match the release. Some departments still use handler code names instead of full names." She didn't know what that meant. She knew the word he was fishing for without knowing why she knew it. It surfaced on its own, a word that finished itself in her mouth before her brain caught up to why. "Lantern," she said. She said it quietly, not for effect. It came out soft and unguarded, before she remembered, for 1 second, that she wasn't alone in the kitchen anymore. Warren used to say it low, almost under his breath, when he came in from the yard at dusk and the porch light wasn't on yet. Lantern, a joke between the two of them that had never once left the house. She had not said it out loud since the funeral. 4 dogs rose at once, not one. 4 of them, Echo, Ranger, Ash, Willow, each standing in a separate run along the side wall, none able to see the others past the concrete dividers. All 4 stood from a lying position in the same half-second, heads turning toward the reception window, ears up, bodies stiff in that particular way of a dog listening for something it has heard before and needs to hear again. The young man's pen stopped moving. "Ma'am," he said. "Did you say that on purpose?" She hadn't. She looked at the dogs through the wire mesh, and the dogs looked back, 4 sets of eyes fixed on the exact spot where she stood, and for a moment none of them moved, and neither did she. "I don't know," she said. It was the truest thing she'd said all week. He wrote something on the clipboard, then crossed it out. "It's not on the identifier list. I'll have to flag it for whoever handles the older files." She signed where he pointed. Somewhere in the middle of signing, her eyes crossed one of the runs, Ranger's, a dog with a black saddle over tan, and caught, low on the left foreleg, a patch of fur that grew in the wrong direction, a thin seam under it, pale against the tan. She didn't have time to look closer. The young man was already sliding the clipboard back for a second signature, and she gave it, and the moment passed quickly, the kind of small thing that slips by when you're carrying a box you don't want to be holding. On her way out, the hallway narrowed past a records room with its door propped open by a rubber wedge. A cassette recorder sat on a metal shelf inside, playing low, a training session logged years back, someone's voice giving commands to a dog that wasn't in the room anymore. She couldn't make out the words, just the register of it, low, even, patient in a way she recognized before she recognized why. She stopped in the hallway for exactly 1 second, then she kept walking, because if she stood there any longer she would have had to admit whose voice it was. She got into her car in the gravel lot, set the box on the passenger seat, and sat with both hands on the wheel without starting the engine, staring at a kennel row where 4 government dogs had come to their feet the instant she said a word that belonged only to her kitchen, and a man 3 years in the ground. She hadn't meant to go back inside. She'd meant to drive home. But the box sat on the passenger seat, half full, and the thought of pulling out of that lot, without asking one more question, felt like leaving a door open on purpose. A man was crossing the gravel, toward the reception building, when she got out of the car again. Older, maybe 60, a faded ball cap, with a unit patch worn soft at the edges, walking with the kind of limp that had settled in and stopped bothering to announce itself. He slowed when he saw her standing by the kennel fence, looking in at the 4 dogs, who had not fully settled back down. "You're the one who said it," he said, not a question. "I'm sorry?" "Lantern," he said the word carefully, like he was setting something down instead of speaking it. "I was in the break room, heard the whole kennel go up like that, figured somebody dropped a pan." She studied him. Retired, she guessed, by the way he stood, at ease but not quite off duty, a man who'd spent 30 years being told where to stand and hadn't fully unlearned it. "You know that word?" He didn't answer right away. He looked past her, at Echo, who was still on her feet, still facing the fence line, tail low and still. "Miguel Ruiz," he said finally, holding out a hand. "Staff sergeant, retired. I worked with your husband, 2 rotations." Her hand found the strap of her bag and gripped it, though she hadn't meant to. "You knew Warren." "I did." He said it plainly, no cushioning, and something in that plainness steadied her more than sympathy would have. "Good man, good handler, best I ever worked next to." "Do you know what that word means? Lantern?" Ruiz's jaw worked once, like he was chewing on the answer before deciding whether to spit it out or swallow it. He looked at the dogs again instead of at her. "I know it," he said. "Then tell me." "Ma'am," he stopped, started again. "That name wasn't ever supposed to leave this kennel." The wind picked up a loose sheet of paper somewhere behind the fence line and pinned it against the wire, and neither of them moved to free it. "I set it in my kitchen for 11 years, Margaret said. "It left the kennel a long time before today. That landed somewhere." She watched it land, a small flinch at the corner of his eye, gone almost before she caught it. He took his cap off, ran a hand over gray hair cropped close to the scalp, put the cap back on. "Come inside a minute," he said, "out of the sun." The office they ended up in wasn't the reception desk, but a side room down the hall, walls lined with framed photographs of handlers and their dogs going back 2 decades, some in color faded orange, some black and white. A desktop computer sat next to a bank of filing cabinets that looked older than the computer by a generation. Ruiz didn't sit behind the desk. He stood near it, arms crossed, like a man deciding how much weight a chair could hold before he trusted it. "You have to understand something," he said. "Warren didn't talk about work at home. None of us did. Wasn't allowed to, half the time, and the half that was allowed, we didn't want to bring it through the door anyway. I know that. I lived it. Then you know there's things that happen inside a program that never make it onto paper. Not because anybody's hiding a crime, because paper means somebody has to sign off on it, and signing off means somebody official decided it was fine to do, and sometimes what gets done isn't official. It's just right, for the dog, for the moment. Is that what Lantern is? Something Warren did that wasn't official? He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either, and the not denying told her more than a yes would have. "I can't be the one to answer that for you," he said. "It's not mine to give away." "Whose is it then?" "There's a file review coming, end of the month, everything connected to your husband's program, all his old training logs, his methods, whatever's still on paper, it's due to be closed out and archived." Once that happens, he stopped himself again, the second time in 5 minutes, and this time she watched him actually decide not to finish a sentence, rather than simply run out of words. "Once that happens, what?" "Once that happens, there's people whose job it is to make sure the record only says what it's supposed to say. That's all I'll tell you today." She looked at him for a long moment. Behind him, through the office window, she could see a sliver of the kennel run. Ranger, lying down again now, but with his head up, watching the door like a man expecting someone to walk back through it any second. "I'm not going to stop asking," she said. Ruiz almost smiled. "It didn't quite make it all the way there." "No," he said. "I didn't figure you would. Your husband married a woman who doesn't let things go. Used to say so, actually. Called it your best and worst quality, both at once." For the first time since she'd walked into that kennel, Margaret Kessler felt something other than grief sitting in her chest. It sat next to the grief, not instead of it. But it was there, small, stubborn, already refusing to be talked out of itself. "Tell me one thing," she said. "Is there someone here who could tell me the whole truth, not half of it, not what you're allowed to say, all of it?" Ruiz looked at the door, then back at her, and for a second she thought he'd already said too much and was about to walk it back. "There's a man runs the program now," he said instead. "SFC Petrakis. He's got the current files. If it's written down anywhere official, it's in his system." He hesitated. "I wouldn't get your hopes up, though." She didn't ask why. She was already turning toward the door. SFC Owen Petrakis had the kind of office that looked like it belonged to a man who'd rather be anywhere else, a desk too clean for someone who worked at it, a coffee mug with a unit crest gone gray from washing, a wall calendar with the current week circled twice in red marker. He was younger than Ruiz by 15 years at least, with the particular tiredness of someone who'd inherited a job he hadn't fully wanted. Mrs. Kessler. He stood when she came in, gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sergeant Ruiz said you'd be by. I have to tell you up front, I don't have a lot of time before the inspection team gets here Friday, so I only need a few minutes. He nodded, sat, pulled the keyboard toward him. Above his monitor, a corkboard held a printed inspection schedule, 3 lines of it already highlighted in yellow, a sticky note in the corner that just said FRI in block capitals underlined twice. You're asking about a training identifier. Lantern. Yes. His fingers moved over the keys. She watched his face while he typed, in the manner of someone who trusts a face more than the machine it's operating. He scrolled again. Typed a second query, this one with more letters, more variations, and she caught the word handler and the word notes before the columns blurred past too fast to follow. She could see the reflection of the screen in his glasses. There's nothing, he said. Look again. Ma'am, I've searched the current database, the legacy import from the old system, and the handler notes field, which is where anything unofficial usually ends up, if it ends up anywhere at all. He turned the monitor slightly, not enough to actually show her anything meaningful, but enough to prove he wasn't hiding it from her. It's not here. There's no training identifier, no command word, no handler note by that name, nothing. My husband used that word with those dogs. I watched 4 of them stand up the second I said it. I believe that something happened, he said it carefully, the way you handle a piece of glass you're not sure is cracked. I don't doubt what you saw, but a reaction isn't a record. Dogs respond to all kinds of things, tone, cadence, a word that sounds like something else they were trained on. It doesn't mean, it means something, it might, but ma'am, if it's not in the training record, it doesn't exist, not as far as this program is concerned. I'm sorry. The words landed flat and final, like a door shut by someone who isn't angry, just finished with the conversation. She felt the floor tilt slightly under something she hadn't realized she'd been standing on, the small, unreasonable hope she'd carried out of Ruiz's office, that somewhere in this building there was a piece of paper that would simply hand her the truth. Then how do you explain what those dogs did? Petrakis exhaled through his nose, glanced at the door as if checking that it was closed. Honestly, I can't. And that's exactly the problem. We have an inspection team coming Friday to review every active handler-dog pairing in this facility. 4 dogs displaying an unlogged, synchronized behavioral response to an unrecognized verbal cue. That's not a sentimental footnote to them. That's a red flag. It reads like undocumented conditioning. It could look like a training failure, or worse, like something was deliberately kept off the books to hide a problem. So you're going to punish the dogs for remembering my husband? I'm not punishing anyone. His voice tightened, the first real crack in the professional calm. I have to separate Echo, Ranger, Ash, and Willow from general handling starting tomorrow morning for individual behavioral assessment. It's procedure. If I don't do it and the inspection team finds an unexplained anomaly on their own, it's not just those 4 dogs that get flagged. It's the whole program. You're taking them away from me before I even got to ask them anything. They're military working dogs, ma'am. They were never yours to ask. He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. He looked down at his own hands for a second, then back up at her, and for a moment she saw something under the procedure, a man doing a job he didn't like the shape of, hoping the shape would hold anyway. I have 4 days until this review closes out, and after that, every file connected to programs from your husband's era gets archived and locked. I don't have room right now to chase down something that isn't written anywhere. I wish I did. 4 days, she repeated. It sounded shorter out loud than it had in her head. Friday the review closes. Whatever's flagged after that goes into long-term storage, off-site. I won't have access to pull it back once it's gone, not without a request that takes months to clear. I'm telling you that so you understand what you're up against, not to discourage you. You keep saying that like it's a comfort. It's not meant as one." He rubbed at his eyes with the heel of one hand, a gesture that looked less like exhaustion and more like a man trying to press a headache back into place before it could get worse. "I've got a 2-star general staff coming through this facility in 4 days, ma'am. Every kennel, every file, every training log. If they find one unexplained thing, it doesn't just cost me, it costs the funding for the whole program, and that costs every dog in this yard, not just the 4 you're asking about. So the truth is inconvenient, the truth is unmeasured. That's different. I'm not saying it isn't real, I'm saying I have no instrument in this building that can measure it, and in 4 days somebody's coming who's only going to trust the instruments." He looked past her, toward the window that faced the kennel row, and for a second his voice lost its official edge entirely. "I didn't take this job to be the man who tells widows their husbands didn't do what they clearly did. I took it because I like dogs and I was good at handling them. Most days that's still true. Today it doesn't feel like enough." She stood very still, the way she used to stand in the kitchen doorway on the nights Warren came home and didn't say anything for the first 10 minutes, learning a long time ago that some silences needed to be let alone before they'd open. "You're telling me I imagined it," she said quietly. "I'm telling you the record doesn't back it up." He said it like a man reading from a script he hadn't written but had agreed to deliver. "I know that's not the same as saying you imagined it, but it's the only thing I have to go on, and in 4 days, it's the only thing that'll be left." He stood, came around the desk, and for a moment she thought he meant to walk her out himself. Instead, he stopped a few feet from her, hands loose at his sides, and said something that didn't sound like procedure at all. "For what it's worth, I never met your husband. I inherited this program 2 years after he retired. Everything I know about him is second-hand, from men like Ruiz who won't say more than they have to. I'd like to know more too. I just can't build a case on a feeling, mine or yours." She didn't answer that. She turned and walked out past the kennel row, on her way to the parking lot. The gate at the end had a new padlock on it, bright silver against the weathered chain link, the kind of lock that hadn't been there that morning. Through the fence, Ranger lay with his chin on his paws, watching her pass, not moving, the pale seam on his foreleg catching the last of the afternoon light. She stopped at the lock, tested it with 2 fingers, though she knew it would hold. The metal was already warm from the sun, and somewhere down the row, a water hose dripped steadily against concrete, the only sound in a yard that had gone quiet, the way places go quiet right before something in them changes. A single moth beat itself softly against the reception window behind her, over and over, patient in the way only something with no memory can be patient. Somewhere behind her, in Petrakis's office, a phone started ringing, and nobody answered it. The public visitor path ran along the outside of the kennel yard, separated from the runs by a second fence, chain link on chain link, 10 feet of gravel between them, close enough to see, too far to touch. Margaret hadn't planned on coming back the next morning. She told herself she was driving to the pharmacy. The turn onto the base access road happened before she'd finished deciding. Frost still sat in the low corners of the yard where the sun hadn't reached, and her breath showed in the air when she stopped at the outer fence. A handler she didn't recognize was walking the row with a clipboard, checking each dog in turn, writing something after every stop. Assessment day. Petrakis's 4 days had started, and it showed already in small ways, a chalkboard near the gate with 4 names written on it, each followed by a time slot, SS0800, SS0900, the kind of schedule that turned a living thing into an appointment. Ranger was in the 3rd run. He stood when she approached the fence, the way he had the day before, but this time there was no reception desk between them, no cardboard box in her arms. Just the 2 fences and the gravel, and a dog watching her walk the length of his run, at the same slow pace he was walking his own, matching her step for step, the unhurried mirroring of a dog that had decided she was worth pacing. She stopped where he stopped. His foreleg was easier to see in the morning light, no fur on the inside, a pale line maybe 2 inches long, old enough that the surrounding hair had grown back thick around it, but the scar tissue itself stayed smooth and hairless, a seam that caught the light differently than the rest of him. Up close, she could see a second, smaller mark just below it, the kind of thin nick a stitch leaves once the thread's long gone. The handler with the clipboard noticed her and came over, not unkindly. Young, a woman this time, a name tape that read Delacroix, a travel mug of coffee steaming faintly in the cold. "Ma'am, you're not supposed to be past the outer line during assessments, but I'll give you a minute since he's calm around you. Most people, he just watches. He's coming right up to the fence for you. What happened to his leg?" Delacroix glanced down at Ranger's foreleg like she was checking a fact she already half knew. "There's a note in his medical file, training injury, a few years back, before my time. Detonation simulation went wrong somehow, caught his leg on a piece of rebar in the debris pile. Bad enough it needed stitches, not bad enough to wash him out. Do you know who was handling him when it happened?" "No, ma'am, that part's not in the file, just the injury and the treatment." She hesitated, looking at Ranger, who hadn't moved from his spot at the fence. "Funny thing is, that's usually the kind of injury that makes a dog gun-shy around that specific drill for the rest of his career. I've seen it before. A dog gets hurt on a range once, and you can retire him early because he'll never trust that ground again. Ranger's fine with it. Better than fine, he's one of our steadiest dogs on simulated field exercises, doesn't flinch at the charge marker, doesn't hesitate going into a debris pile. Whoever worked with him after that injury did something right." Margaret looked at the scar, then at the dog's face, which was turned toward her, ears forward, still and patient in a way that had nothing to do with training commands she could see or hear. Down the row, a different handler was running Ash through a basic obedience pass, clipboard balanced on one forearm, calling out simple commands in the flat, testing voice assessors used. Ash performed each one a half-second late, as though he were waiting for a different voice to confirm the first one had been real. Margaret watched him sit, then watched the handler make a small mark on the clipboard that Ash couldn't see and wouldn't have understood if he had, and her hands curled at her sides, useless, at how easily a hesitation like that could be read as a flaw instead of a memory. She crouched at the outer fence, slow, careful not to startle him. Reached her fingers through the diamond gap in the wire, not far enough to reach the inner fence, just far enough to make the gesture plain. Ranger closed the distance on his side, didn't flinch, didn't sniff cautiously. The caution a strange dog shows a stranger's hand nowhere in him. He simply came, put his nose an inch from her fingers, through 2 layers of fence he couldn't fully cross, and looked at her, not at her hand, at her face. She had been looked at by dogs before, Warren's dogs, dogs at shelters, dogs on television specials about redemption and rescue that she'd never quite been able to finish watching since the funeral. This was different. This was a dog looking at her the way you look at someone you're trying to place, trying to remember where you know them from, she thought, unexpectedly, of Warren standing at their own back door years ago, home 2 days from a long rotation, looking at her the exact same way for a full 3 seconds before either of them said a word, like a man reacquainting himself with proof that something he'd trusted was still there. "He doesn't do that with just anyone," Delacroix said quietly, watching, her clipboard forgotten against her hip. "I've walked this row for 8 months. He's polite with people. He does his job. He takes his treats. He lets the vet check his teeth without a fuss. He doesn't do," she gestured at the 2 of them, at the stillness between the fences, "that." Margaret didn't answer. She kept her fingers where they were, and Ranger kept his nose an inch from them, and for a moment the whole yard seemed to hold that same stillness, the other 3 dogs in their runs down the line, quiet, watching without watching, the way animals do when something is happening that concerns the whole group, even if only one of them is standing close enough to be part of it. Ash had stopped pacing his own run. Echo lay with her head up, ears turned toward the fence line rather than the handler still working her section. "I need to know what really happened to this dog," Margaret said. "Not the version in a medical file, the real one." Delacroix shook her head slowly. "I only started here 2 years ago. I wasn't around for whatever this was. But," she glanced toward the reception building, lowered her voice further, though there was no one else in earshot, "there's an old sergeant who still comes around sometimes, Ruiz. If anybody remembers what actually happened out there, it'd be him. He was here back then." I've seen him talk to Ranger like he's known him since he was a pup, sits right down on the gravel with him sometimes, doesn't even bring treats, just sits. I've talked to him, Margaret said. He told me half of something and then stopped. Then maybe you ask him the other half. Delacroix straightened, checked her watch, the clipboard already pulling her attention back toward the next run. Willow, 3 doors down, who had started pacing the moment the schedule board went up that morning. I've got to keep moving, ma'am. I'm sorry. But for what it's worth. She looked back once at Ranger, still standing at the fence, still watching Margaret with that same unbroken attention. I don't think that dog forgot whatever happened to him, and I don't think he thinks you're a stranger. She walked on down the row, calling something soft to Willow before crouching at her gate. Margaret watched her go, watched the clipboard tuck itself back under one arm, watched a dog she still knew almost nothing about begin to pace faster at the sight of a stranger approaching with a stopwatch and a checklist neither of them had asked for. Margaret stayed at the fence a moment longer, fingers still through the wire, Ranger's breath fogging faintly in the cold morning air an inch from her hand, and for the first time since she'd walked out of Petrakis's office the day before, she felt something steadier than hope. She felt certain, the way she rarely let herself feel certain about anything since the funeral, when certainty had started to feel like a luxury reserved for people whose husbands were still alive to confirm it. Whatever had happened to this dog, and whatever word her husband had left buried inside 4 government animals that no file remembered, she was not leaving until someone told her the truth of it, fence or no fence, 4 days or not. She thought of the padlock on the far gate, bright and new against rusted chain link, and understood for the first time that the lock wasn't there to keep the dogs in. It was there to keep her out, and someone had decided that within a single afternoon of her asking one question too many. She stood up, brushed the gravel dust from her knees, and looked once more down the row, at Ash still hesitating a half-second behind every command, at Willow pacing tighter circles as Delacroix's clipboard drew near, at Echo lying still with her ears turned the wrong way for an obedience test, and the right way for a woman standing at a fence, and walked back to her car, already composing what she'd say to Ruiz the second she found him. She found Ruiz at a diner 2 miles off base, the kind of place with a coffee pot that never fully emptied, and a radio behind the counter tuned low to a station that played whatever it had played since 1985. He was alone in a corner booth, a newspaper folded but unread beside his cup, like a man who'd brought it as a prop rather than a plan. A waitress with a name tag that read Bonnie topped off his coffee without being asked and moved on without a word, the kind of quiet practice service that only comes from decades of the same regulars. He didn't look surprised when she slid into the booth across from him. "Delacroix called you a soft touch," Margaret said, "for an old sergeant. Delacroix talks too much." But there was no heat in it. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on its saucer, the same idle motion Margaret recognized in her own hands with her ring. "You saw Ranger's leg." "I saw the scar. I saw a young handler tell me he shouldn't be as steady as he is, given what happened. I want you to tell me what happened." Ruiz was quiet long enough that the radio finished one song and started another, something with a steel guitar that neither of them acknowledged. When he spoke, his voice had dropped the careful, guarded register from the kennel yard. This time it sounded tired instead of careful. There was a detonation simulation, standard field exercise, controlled charge, timed. Dogs worked the debris pile after to locate a marker scent. Should have been routine. The charge went off a half-second early. Ranger was already moving into the pile when it did. He hit a piece of rebar wrong on the way down, tore the leg open. Bad enough that for about 10 seconds, everybody standing there thought they were about to lose a working dog to something that should never have happened on a training range. Whose fault was it? Officially, equipment malfunction, timer failure. Signed off, filed, no names attached beyond the maintenance crew that serviced the charge. He looked at her steadily. Unofficially, there's a name attached. There's always a name attached. In a small program like ours, somebody made a call on timing that day. Somebody who'd been overruled once before on the same equipment and got overruled again. Was it Warren? No, he said it fast enough that she believed it. Your husband wasn't the one who called the timing, but he was the one who worked with Ranger afterward. 6 weeks of rehab, most of it off the books, most of it after hours, because the dog's official recovery timeline said he needed 8 more weeks before returning to detonation-adjacent work. And Warren didn't think 8 weeks of sitting in a kennel with nothing but the memory of that noise was going to help a dog get past it. He thought the opposite. He thought the dog needed to go back sooner, gently, on his own terms, with someone he trusted standing next to him the whole way. Margaret felt her chest go tight, and it had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with recognition. This was Warren. This was exactly the shape of the man she'd married, the one who never waited for permission when he was certain he was right, and never once told her about it, because telling her meant admitting he'd gone around a system that existed for good reasons he simply didn't trust in that particular case. "That's when it started," she said. Not a question. Lantern. Ruiz nodded once, slow. He needed something to call the dog back with, out on that range, that didn't sound like any of the official commands, something that meant "you're safe, come back to me" instead of "do the task." He picked a word nobody else would use by accident, something private. "I don't know where he got it from. He got it from me." Her voice caught on it, the first real crack since she'd walked into the kennel 2 days ago. "It was ours, before the dog's, before any of it. My father kept a lantern lit on the porch every night of my childhood, so my brother could find his way home from the mill after dark. Warren asked about it once, early on, before we were even married, and I told him. He never forgot it, he just never told me he was still carrying it around." Ruiz looked down at his coffee, turning the cup another quarter turn. "Then I guess he gave your husband something a training manual couldn't. And your husband gave it to 4 dogs, who needed it more than either of you probably ever knew." 4, she repeated, "not just Ranger. Once it worked with Ranger, word travels in a small unit, not officially, just handler to handler. Your husband started using it quiet, low-key, with the others who'd been through something rough. Echo washed out of a bomb detection assignment after a bad exposure incident, came back skittish for months, wouldn't go near a doorway without somebody walking it first. Ash lost his first handler in country, spent a year barely working at all, sat in his run and wouldn't take a leash from anyone. Willow, he stopped. What about Willow? That one's not mine to tell. He met her eyes, and there it was again, the same wall she'd hit in his office 2 days before, except this time it had a crack in it, a place where the mortar had already started to give. "I can tell you what happened to Ranger's leg. I watched it happen. I was there for the rehab. I know that part cold. I can't tell you who fixed the deeper thing your husband was fixing in that dog, or in any of them, because I never asked. Some things you don't ask a man like Warren. You just watch him do it and you're grateful somebody's willing to." "That's not an answer. It's the only half I've got, ma'am." He said it gently, but it landed like Petrakis's refusal had the day before, a door closing, this time not out of procedure, but out of something that looked closer to grief. "I can tell you what happened to the dog. I can't tell you who fixed it. Not yet." "Why not yet? What's stopping you?" He didn't answer that either. He looked out the window at the parking lot for a moment, at nothing in particular, the way a man looks at a middle distance when he's deciding how much of himself to hand over. His thumb worried the rim of the cup, once, twice, before he set it down entirely. "Because some of the people who'd have to answer for it are still wearing the uniform," he said finally. "Not Warren. Him, it's easy, he's gone. Whatever gets said about him now can't touch him anymore. But there's a man who's still on this base, still drawing a paycheck, who'd have some explaining to do if the whole story got laid out in front of the wrong desk. I don't know if that man deserves protecting. I've never been able to decide. So I've spent 7 years not deciding, which I suppose is its own kind of decision." He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small spiral notebook, flipped it to a page near the back, and turned it toward her without a word. A single line, written in handwriting she didn't recognize, dated 7 years back. Session log, full recording archived, unit training folder, ref Kessler/Lantern. "There's a recording," he said, "somewhere in the old archive, if it hasn't been pulled already for the review. Your husband narrated some of his sessions, habit from his first unit, said it helped him think out loud. If you want the rest of it, the real rest, ask for that file before Friday. Ask Petrakis. Tell him you know it exists. You just told me the record says Lantern doesn't exist. The official record doesn't. Ruiz closed the notebook, slid it back into his pocket like he was putting something away for good. But nobody erases an audio archive without somebody signing off first, and nobody signed off on that yet, not that I've heard. He stood, dropped a few bills on the table for a coffee he'd barely touched, and looked down at her one last time before he left, one hand braced on the back of the booth like his knee had decided the conversation had cost it something too. "Friday's coming fast, Mrs. Kessler," he said. "Whatever you're going to do with what I've told you, I'd do it soon." She sat alone in the booth after he'd gone, the radio playing something she didn't recognize, the coffee across from her going cold, the newspaper he'd left folded and unread still sitting where he'd set it down. Bonnie came by once more with the coffee pot, saw the untouched cup across from her, and left without asking, the way people who've worked a diner counter for years learn to leave grief alone. Outside the window, a school bus idled at the light, kids' faces pressed to the glass, none of them looking her way. Somewhere in an archive she hadn't been allowed near, her husband's voice was on a tape nobody had listened to in years, narrating exactly what he'd done and why, and somewhere behind that, still unnamed, was the reason Ruiz had stopped himself twice now, instead of finishing a sentence he clearly knew how to finish, and the reason a man still on this base had every right to be afraid of what she might find. Warren's workroom hadn't changed since the week he died. Margaret had promised herself, more than once, that she'd clear it out, donate the tools, box up the manuals, turn the space into something useful, a sewing room, a guest room, anything that wasn't a museum to a man who wasn't coming back to use any of it. She had never once opened the door with a box in her hands. Tonight she opened it with nothing, just herself, and the porch light left on behind her because she hadn't wanted to walk down the hallway in the dark. The room smelled the way it always had, leather and machine oil, and underneath that, faintly, the cedar of the closet where he'd kept his good jacket. A metal desk sat under the window, still cluttered with his handwriting. Field notes, half a crossword, a coffee mug with a skin of dust inside it that she'd never had the heart to wash. A calendar on the wall was still turned to the month he died, the days after the 14th blank. Waiting for appointments that had never come. She hadn't touched any of it in 3 years. She touched it now. The bottom drawer stuck the way it always had. She worked it loose with both hands, as Warren used to, jiggling the handle up before pulling, and it gave all at once, spilling a little dust into the air that caught the lamplight like something suspended in water. Behind a stack of old field manuals, pushed to the back where a drawer that size shouldn't have had room for anything else, sat a tin box. Not military issue, an old cookie tin, the kind that came filled with butter shortbread at Christmas, the lid dented at one corner, the painted holly design faded to a ghost of red and green. She knew, before she opened it, that it was his. Inside, a stack of index cards, rubber-banded together, the band gone brittle and snapping the moment she touched it. Handwriting she'd know anywhere, small and slanted, the same hand that used to leave her notes on the kitchen counter when he left before she woke. Each card had a name at the top: Ranger, Echo, Ash, Willow, and beneath each name, dates, and beneath the dates, short lines of notes that read less like military records and more like a man talking to himself about something he cared too much about to write down officially. Ranger, 3rd week back on the range, flinched at the charge marker, held position anyway, told him Lantern, walked him through it slow. He came. Every time now he comes. Ash, 6 months since he lost Corporal Reyes, won't take food from my hand still. Sat with him an hour tonight, didn't push anything, said the word once at the end, low, not expecting anything. He looked up. Echo, cleared for detection work again today, official record. Nobody up top knows what it took to get her steady enough to walk into that building. She knows, I know. That's enough. Margaret sat down on the floor of the workroom, with her back against the desk, the tin box open in her lap, and read through every card twice, then a third time, letting the small dated entries stack themselves into a shape she hadn't let herself see all at once until now. Years of quiet, unrecorded work, a man mending what a program had no line item for. There was no card for Willow. She noticed that on the second pass, 3 names repeated across a dozen cards each, and 1 name entirely absent, as though whatever had happened with that 4th dog had never made it even into a private tin box hidden at the back of a drawer. She thought of Ruiz stopping himself mid-sentence in the diner booth. That one's not mine to tell. Near the bottom of the stack, 1 card sat apart from the others, not rubber-banded with the rest, tucked into a fold in the tin's lining like it had been placed there deliberately, meant to be found last. It had no dog's name at the top. Just 1 word, written larger than anything else in the box, underlined 3 times hard enough that the pen had nearly torn the card. Lantern. No explanation beneath it, no date. Just the word, and the 3 lines under it, and the pressure of a man's hand pressing down harder than he needed to for 3 letters and change. She sat with that card a long time. She thought about what it would mean to bring this box to Petrakis before Friday, to hand a stranger in a government office the private, unofficial diary of a man who'd spent his last years quietly rewriting the rules of a program he believed in, using a word that belonged to no one but the 2 of them. She thought about Ruiz's face in the booth, the fear under the tiredness, the way he'd said some things you don't ask a man like Warren, you just watch him do it and you're grateful somebody's willing to. If she brought this box forward, Ruiz's silence stopped being his choice. Petrakis's clean files stopped being clean. Whoever had made the call on that timer, whoever's name sat quietly underneath the official story about equipment malfunction, that story would have a crack running through it too, and she had no way of controlling where the crack went once she let it show. She thought about her son. Daniel hadn't spoken to her since the funeral, not really, cards at Christmas, a phone call on her birthday that lasted 4 minutes and covered the weather. He'd wanted to go through his father's things right after the service, sit with the workroom, ask questions about what his dad had actually done overseas, the parts nobody talked about at dinner. She had told him no, not yet, too soon. She had kept the door closed on this room, the same way the program had kept a card closed on Willow, the same way Ruiz kept closing his sentences before they finished, telling herself it was protection. When some nights, alone with a coffee mug she couldn't bring herself to wash, she suspected it had only ever been fear dressed up as care. For 3 years she had asked her own son for silence. He'd had every right to grieve out loud instead. She was not going to do the same thing to 4 dogs and a dead man's last piece of honesty. She closed the tin box, but not all the way. She left the last card sitting on top, face up, the word catching the lamplight the way Warren's handwriting always had, like he'd pressed hard enough on purpose, so that whoever found it eventually wouldn't be able to miss it. Friday was 3 days away. She had a box, a word and a name still missing from it. She picked up her car keys off the workroom desk before she'd fully decided to, the tin held against her chest with one arm, the porch light behind her still burning, though she'd meant to turn it off for good 3 years ago. Ruiz met her at the kennel gate this time, not the diner. She'd called ahead, the first time in this whole ordeal she'd asked permission for anything, and he'd agreed to come back to base after hours, when the yard was quieter and the day handlers had gone home. The security light above the gate buzzed faintly, throwing a cone of white over the gravel, moths already circling it though the sun had only just gone down. She held the tin box out to him before either of them said hello. He didn't take it right away. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's been dreading and half expecting in equal measure, the dented lid, the ghost of holly paint, a box he'd probably seen sitting closed in a drawer decades ago and never once asked to open. "That his?" he said. "You know it is." He took it then, opened the lid slow, the way she had. He didn't read every card the way she had. He went straight for the one on top, the one with no dog's name, just the word, underlined 3 times. His hand wasn't steady when he set it back down. "He never told me he wrote it down," Ruiz said. "Any of it. He never told me either. I found it tonight, in his workroom, in a drawer that's been shut for 3 years. She took a step closer, close enough that the security light lit both their faces. "I'm done being handed half of something, Sergeant Ruiz. You said you couldn't tell me who fixed the deeper thing. I'm not asking you to guess anymore. I'm asking you to finish the sentence you keep starting." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might close the box and hand it back and walk away like he had at the diner. Instead, he sat down on the low concrete curb that ran along the kennel fence, easing himself down slow, his knees deciding the conversation was going to take a while, and set the tin box on his lap. Ranger's leg wasn't the only thing that went wrong that season, he said. There was a review, after, informal, nothing official, but enough people upstairs were nervous about equipment failures on the range that your husband's methods came under a magnifying glass too. Off-book rehab timelines, undocumented behavioral conditioning. Somebody used exactly those words in a memo I saw once and was never supposed to see. He looked up at her. If Warren had reported what he was doing with these dogs, he'd have had to explain why he thought the official recovery protocol was wrong. That's not a small thing to say out loud in a program still investigating why a timer went off early. It reads like an accusation. It reads like the system already failed these dogs once, and I don't trust it not to fail them again. So he said nothing. He said nothing, and he kept doing it anyway, quietly, dog by dog. He built something that worked better than the protocol, and he never once tried to take credit for it, because taking credit meant admitting the protocol needed fixing in the first place, and admitting that meant somebody official had to answer for why it was broken. Ruiz shook his head slowly. I've spent 3 years telling myself I was protecting your husband's reputation by keeping quiet. I think what I was really protecting was myself. If I explain what Lantern is and why it worked, I'm also explaining that I watched it happen for years and never once put it in a report either. That makes me part of the same silence. I've known that the whole time, and I still let it sit there. You're not the man whose name was under that timer decision, are you? No. He said it steady, without flinching from the question, and something in the plainness of it told her he'd rather she'd asked it out loud than let it hang unspoken between them. But I stood next to him plenty of times and said nothing when I should have. That's its own kind of hand on the timer, ma'am. I've made my peace with most of what I did in this uniform. I haven't made peace with that. Say it anyway, Margaret said. All of it, now. Ruiz looked at the kennel row behind her. 4 runs, 4 dogs, all of them lying down for the night but none of them fully asleep, ears tuned even in rest for something still worth hearing. Lantern, he said, was never a command. It wasn't in any manual because your husband never built it to be an instruction. He built it to mean one thing, and one thing only, no matter which dog he said it to or what task they'd been doing when he said it. I see what happened to you, and I'm not leaving. That's it. That's the whole of it. Ranger heard it coming out of a debris pile with a torn leg. Ash heard it the week he stopped eating from anyone's hand. Echo heard it walking back into a building she'd been afraid to enter for months. He paused. Willow heard it the day her first handler didn't come home. Warren was the one who found her in the kennel 3 days after they told her, still waiting by the gate she used to walk out of with him every morning. Nobody had a protocol for a dog grieving a person. Your husband made one up on the spot, standing at that gate, saying a word that had never meant anything to the army and had always meant everything to you. Margaret's hand tightened on the edge of the tin box. She didn't try to speak past it. He never told anyone that word came from home, Ruiz went on. I don't think he thought of it that way, most days. I think it just was what it was, the thing he said when the manual ran out of answers and a dog needed one anyway. It worked on every dog he ever tried it with, every single one, and none of us who watched it work ever once wrote it down, because writing it down meant admitting the manual had a hole in it big enough for a man to walk 4 broken dogs through, one at a time, for years, without anyone noticing. He stopped. He looked, for a second, like a man who had finally set something down he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten the weight of it. His hands, resting on the tin box in his lap, had gone still for the first time all evening. Somewhere past the fence a nightjar called twice and went quiet, and neither of them moved to fill the space it left. In that silence, without either of them saying the word out loud, without either of them planning it, Ruiz said it anyway. Quiet, almost to himself, the way a man repeats a phrase he's just spent 5 minutes explaining, testing the shape of it one more time now that it was finally allowed to exist outside his own head. Lantern. Behind Margaret, 4 dogs came off their beds at once. She turned in time to see it. Echo, Ranger, Ash, Willow, each one rising from a lying position and moving, not toward the fence where she and Ruiz stood, but toward the front of their own individual runs, each dog walking directly to its own gate and stopping there, sitting, facing forward, still, the way a soldier stands at attention when a name is called that belongs only to them. 4 gates, 4 dogs, 1 word, and every one of them had answered it exactly the same way, at exactly the same time, without a single command given beyond the sound of Ruiz's own voice speaking half to himself. Ruiz stood up slowly from the curb, the tin box nearly sliding from his lap before he caught it. He stared at the kennel row like a man seeing something for the first time despite having stood in that exact spot 100 times before. The buzz of the security light seemed suddenly loud in the quiet, the moths still circling, indifferent to everything below them. "I didn't even mean to say it out loud," he said. Margaret didn't answer him right away. She walked to the inner fence instead, close enough now that Ranger, still sitting at his gate, turned his head to track her without breaking position, the way a dog holds a command it's proud to be holding. Beyond him, Willow sat with her whole body angled toward the gate she'd once waited at for a handler who never came back, steady now in a way that looked, for the first time since Margaret had met her, like something closer to rest than vigilance. She thought of the padlock down the row, the schedule board with its assessment times, 4 days that had felt, until tonight, like a countdown working against her. It didn't feel that way anymore. It felt like a door standing open that nobody had noticed yet. Then maybe it needed saying, she said, by someone who wasn't trying to. She was watching 4 dogs sit perfectly still at 4 separate gates in the dark, waiting for a man who had been dead 3 years, and understanding finally, all the way down, exactly what her husband had spent his last years quietly building and exactly why he had never once told her. He hadn't been keeping a secret from her. He'd been doing for 4 dogs who couldn't ask for it any other way, precisely what she had spent 3 years failing to do for her own son. The retired handler's ceremony was already half full when Margaret arrived, folding chairs set in rows under the flags of the base's small assembly hall, a long table at the front draped in unit colors with photographs of dogs and handlers going back 30 years. Warren's photo sat near the far end, young, unsmiling in the way he always was for official pictures, a much younger Echo sitting at his side. Petrakis stood near the podium in his dress uniform, running through notes. Friday. The inspection had come and gone that morning. Margaret had heard, second-hand, through Delacroix, that the file review had closed without incident. Warren Kessler's training era archived clean, nothing flagged. By tonight, if she did nothing, Lantern would exist only in a tin box and in the memory of 4 dogs who couldn't testify to a review board. She walked to the front with the box under her arm, past rows of retired handlers in pressed shirts, past a table with a coffee urn nobody was using yet, past Ruiz, already seated near the front, who watched her go by without a word and without looking away either. Petrakis saw her coming, and something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, more like a man watching a weather front he'd been warned about finally arrive. "Mrs. Kessler, the ceremony's about to start. If you—" "I need 2 minutes before it does." She set the tin box on the table beside Warren's photograph and opened it, letting him see the whole of it. A dozen cards in Warren's careful, slanted hand. Years of a man doing the work the manual couldn't hold. "You told me if it's not in the record, it doesn't exist," she said, loud enough now that the nearest rows had gone quiet. "This is the record. It was never digital, never official. It's a cookie tin from a dead man's desk drawer, and it's the only thing on this base that tells the truth about what your predecessor did for 4 dogs nobody else knew how to save." She lifted the last card and read it aloud. "Lantern." Through the assembly hall's side windows, which looked out onto the kennel yard where the 4 dogs waited for the evening's small tribute, all 4 came to their feet at once. Then they ran, not toward the window, toward their own gates, the same way they had 3 nights earlier, and stopped there, sitting, facing the hall, still. A murmur went through the folding chairs. Someone near the back stood halfway up to see better, then sat again. An older man 2 rows over set down his coffee cup without drinking from it. Ruiz, seated near the front, hadn't moved, but his jaw had gone tight in a way Margaret recognized now for what it was. A man watching, in public, the thing he'd spent years keeping private, and finding he wasn't sorry to see it. Petrakis stood at the podium and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he stepped away from it. He walked to the table, picked up the last card himself, and turned to face the room. 4 days ago, he said, I told this woman that if something wasn't written down, it didn't exist. I believed that when I said it, I was wrong. Nobody moved. This word is real, he said. It was never written down, because writing it down meant admitting we'd had it wrong before him, that this program's protocols had left 4 dogs without an answer for what they'd been through, and one handler quietly built the answer himself rather than wait for paperwork to catch up. He set the card down beside Warren's photograph. I'm going to recommend Lantern be documented as an official trauma response protocol, credited to Sergeant First Class Warren Kessler, effective tonight. He looked at Margaret. That's 4 days too late for you to hear it from me instead of a cookie tin. I'm sorry it took that long. I'm not sorry it's true. She never did ask him for the old recording in the archive. Ruiz had given her the whole of it himself, out loud, at the kennel gate, before she'd needed to ask anyone for anything else. Margaret stood at the front of a room full of strangers, and one man who had known her husband better than she had, 4 dogs sitting still at 4 gates in the dark yard beyond the glass, and felt something in her chest finally come level after 3 years of leaning against nothing. It wasn't relief exactly. It was closer to the feeling of setting something down that had been carried so long the arms had stopped registering the weight, and only now, empty-handed, understanding how heavy it had actually been. Somewhere behind her, a folding chair creaked as its owner finally sat back, and the room exhaled with it. All at once, the way a held breath finally lets go, a whole hall of strangers letting out something they hadn't known they were holding on her behalf. 3 months later, the training manual carried a new page, a trauma response protocol, credited to Sergeant First Class Warren Kessler, the word lantern spelled out in plain type, finally home in a place no Friday could close and lock away. Daniel stood beside her in the kennel yard, watching old footage on a screen against the fence. Warren, younger, kneeling beside 4 much smaller dogs, saying the word for what might have been the first time he'd driven up 2 days after the ceremony. He'd simply stood in the workroom doorway that first night and said he wished she'd let him in sooner. She hadn't argued. The 4 dogs lay together in the grass, off-leash. Willow had worked her way, unbidden, to a spot pressed against Margaret's chair. Margaret set her hand on Daniel's shoulder. He let it sit there, then covered it briefly with his own. The screen went dark. 4 dogs rested in grass that no longer required a secret word to prove someone had seen what happened to them. It was written down now. It would stay written down. Margaret sat with her hand on her son's shoulder and thought, for the first time in 3 years, that grief and peace could share one chest without either needing to win.